Hello, my name is Harriet Hageman, and I am Senior Litigation Counsel with the New Civil Liberties Alliance. I'm very honored today to have the former Secretary of Interior, David Bernhardt, to visit with us about the perspectives of a former secretary. David, welcome. It's wonderful to have you.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Why don't we start out with you giving us just a bit of background information, what you've done, what your education background is, and then your work. And I believe now it's been a couple of administrations.
Yeah, so I grew up in a small Western community in Colorado. It's called Rifle. It's a community that's, if you like to hunt and fish, it's the world's greatest place to grow up. It's a community that's entirely surrounded by public lands, Forest Service lands, BLM lands. And growing up there, it was apparent to me how important to our community was the access to those lands. Hunting season provided important economic opportunities to our community, and so did natural resource development and access to federal lands by grazers. And growing up in that environment was wonderful. And then I went to college in at a small public school in Colorado called the University of Northern Colorado. Came out here to law school, did law school, and then joined a member of Congress's office for about five and a half years. Went into private practice, and in that period of time worked for a former secretary who was a partner at a firm named Gail Norton. And Gail played, when she became secretary, she asked me if I would come work for her as a low-level staffer in the Bush administration. I did that, and I enjoyed the Department of the Interior, and then went back to private practice, and then came back to the Trump administration and served as deputy secretary under Ryan Zinke. And then followed that up by, when he resigned, I served as secretary for the next 2 years. And so I have 11 years at the Department of the Interior, I think.
Okay, wonderful. Quite a bit of experience. Just to give us some idea of the impact and the size of the Department of Interior, how many employees are within that particular agency?
So Interior has, it varies, but between 65,000 and 68,000 employees during the winter, and a whole host of additional seasonal employees during the summer. So the number can creep up into the 90s.
And how many agencies are within the Department of Interior?
Basically, the Department of the Interior encompasses a whole host of agencies. The Bureau of Reclamation, the National Park Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Office of Surface Mining and Reclamation, the offshore agencies, BOEM and BSEE, as well as the U.S. Geological Survey. And so its jurisdiction in terms of managing lands combined amounts to managing about 1 in every 5 acres of land in the United States, and then also the activities that occur on the Outer Continental Shelf, which is also billions of acres.
So you have oversight and jurisdiction within all 50 states, and then offshore as well.
That's right.
And would the Interior be considered one of the larger agencies in our federal government family?
Well, it really depends how you define it. In terms of jurisdiction, it obviously has a significant impact in terms of personnel. You know, it's dwarfed by the Department of Defense, obviously. But you know, one of the interesting things for your audience is that most of the authority that relates to the Department of the Interior comes through the property clause of the Constitution, because obviously it's land that you're managing, and you're managing it generally in whatever way the Congress decided it should be managed. So parks are managed with one set of laws, public domain laws, which public domain lands, which are the lands administered now by the Bureau of Land Management, have a different set of laws. So
Mhm.
as an administrator, it's basically where's the property, what's the regulatory paradigm on the property, and then what activities can take place on that property. So it's really in many ways a large property management company coupled with some very significant trust responsibilities to American Indians, and then also regulatory components that have come through, for example, the Fish and Wildlife Services implementation of the Endangered Species Act.
So what are some of the statutory provisions that you deal with in dealing with Interior?
Well, you start, obviously you start with the basic requirements of most of your work is simply the APA, right? First and foremost, can you rationally articulate where you want your decision to go, and is that bounded by the facts? And you go from there to specific statutes, whether that's the FLTMA or the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, or whatever the underlying authority is the Reclamation Act. And then you go from there to procedural statutes, such as the National Environmental Policy Act, the Endangered Species Act, depending on which side of the coin you're on, either representing the Fish and Wildlife Service or an action agency. And so you have a milieu of the same statutes that basically anyone that deals with approvals or permits for federal lands would come in contact with.
The state of Wyoming has about 30 million acres
That's
that
right.
are federally owned, and about 9.2 million acres of those are within the National Forest Service, with the remainder being overseen by the Department of Interior with BLM and those sorts of the National Park Service. So Wyoming has a very heavy federal footprint, if you will, and I can personally attest to the impact of working with agencies such as the BLM, Department of Interior, Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service. One of the things that I think is important for framing our discussion today is that according to our Declaration of Independence, the governing authority flows from the consent of the governed, meaning all of us, meaning the citizens of this country. And we, the people, elect the president, and the president appoints various senior agency officials, and those officials are tasked with carrying out the law with the assistance of their subordinates. And it is through this mechanism that the Constitution gives the American people a role in choosing the officials who govern them and actually having an impact on policy. But is it fair to say that sometimes career employees fill almost all of the federal positions in our government?
Yeah, so that's a very, first off, your first point is far and away the most important one. The vast majority of decisions that are made at agencies on a daily basis are made with authority that's been delegated to that local or individual employee through a law being passed that the secretary is tasked with. And then that authority has been delegated down and down and down. And so the vast majority of decisions that are made on a daily basis are made by career staff. And those staff are managed, however, they're managed in an individual circumstance. And so the vast majority of decisions at Interior, for example, to just give you a sense of the scope, told you there are 65,000, 70,000 employees at Interior in the winter. There'd be about 70 political appointees in any given time at the Department of Interior. It may float up to 90. So what you're talking about at the end of the day is the president selects, in some cases nominates, some cases directly appoints individuals that fill. At Interior, about 17 positions were filled by an appointment that led to a confirmation position, and then the remainder are just simply appointed. And so you're talking about 90 people, maybe 70 to 90 managing or input, clarifying the president's vision in that environment.
Well, then I was reading and preparing for today that there are approximately 3,800 political appointees in any particular administration, whereas the career federal employees number about 2.2 million. So it is less than 0.2%. 99.8% of all federal employees are career, whereas 0.2% are the political appointees. But it's the political appointees that are tasked with carrying out the policies of a President Trump or a President Biden or a President
That's right.
Obama, correct?
That's absolutely the case.
Okay. So I read also in preparing for this that it can be extremely difficult to remove some of those career employees in terms of the procedure that has been put in place, especially in the last 60 years or so.
Well, that's right. I mean, if you go back and look at the growth of the federal government, I think in the first Congress, at the end of the first Congress, the State Department had 4 employees, a secretary and 3 clerks. And obviously now they probably have about 15,000 employees. So you see a very different dynamic than what the framers were thinking about when they were thinking about the government and how it would operate. And so, that's a vast gulf. The vast majority of the federal employees are phenomenal, and they're trying to carry out, generally, they're trying to carry out the law as they understand it based on the facts that they are given. And then with an overlay appropriately of the policy vision that the president has. And ideally, over time, we went from a system of small government. As it grew, we moved through kind of a spoils period where an election would happen and you would, completely transition people out of government, and then an entire group of folks would reappear, and they said, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Let's move to a federal service where you have a meritocracy that just looks at the world, and then the president comes in, brings his people, and that influence, that policy is what leads, served by this cast of employees. And that's really where we began, really through the progressive era, to move to that sort of dynamic. And now we're at a place that even just my experience between 2001 and today, we've moved from a place where in many instances, the career employees were there to serve whomever was elected, to my second tour of duty during the Trump administration. The vast majority of appointees or career employees were in that category, but some really chose a path of resistance, resistant to the policies of the elected leadership. And to be fair, I even see some indications of that in the Biden administration. In my view, my personal view is that we cannot have a system that operates that way for either party, that is a grave danger, and that it's one thing to have a group of people who are trying to help whoever is elected move their policy vision forward. It's quite another to have them only help one political party when they win, because I think that would mean that essentially we're eliminating the will of the people in that instance. At the end of the day, the people elect whoever they elect with all of their pros and all of their cons. It's a binary choice. And whoever they pick is the leader of our government. And I'm very concerned that there's an effort of some in the civil service on both sides to want to ignore one or the other or both, and that's troubling.
Well, and that's why I started out this discussion with the idea that in our country, it is the consent of the governed. And we let our choices be known and what policies we want to move forward through our elections, whether it is an election in Congress every 2 years, the election of the president every 4 years, or the election of senators every 6 years. That's how we have our voices be known. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about what your experience was working both with the Bush administration as well as the Trump administration, and what you saw as perhaps some philosophical differences and changes over that period of time. And also I want to talk about the civil service rules and how public employment relates to the implementation of policy. The way that I've often described this is that personnel is policy, and how you carry out, especially with a government as big and as vast as the United States, with 330 million people, one president, a Congress, your state governments, how do you carry out the policies or the will of the people? And I think it really does come down to personnel. But again, the political appointees are very, very, very small in number as compared to the vast numbers of public employees. And if you would give us just a little bit about maybe some of the historical perspective that you have in terms of how our government was intended to work.
So, from my perspective, at the end of the day, it's a pretty simple construct originally. It's my opinion that the framers thought, okay, we're going to give the executive branch authority. Congress will pass a law, the executive branch will carry it out. If they need a tool, whether that tool is a shovel or additional personnel or whatever, come to Congress, they'll get it. Congress will write clear legislation, and will task this agency with moving forward with that. And we went from there. Maybe it was, at the end of the day, what you really find out is it's very hard to write clear legislation, because folks want political compromise as they're developing the legislation. Mm-hmm. And that's how you get 218 votes or 60 votes in the Senate. And so that part became a little more challenging. But over time, it's my view that the way a agency official makes a decision is really supposed to be this. We have a statute. It says whatever it says. We have the facts, whatever those are. And then overlaying that, in those two circles would be a third, which is whatever the president's policy, consistent with both the law and the facts, is. And it's those three components that really make up every decision that a federal official should make. And what has happened, in my opinion, over time is employees have begun to focus on the mission of their agency. And they like the mission, but they are not still connected to the words of the statute. And that disconnect leads us to real challenges, in my opinion. And the only way that that disconnect is ultimately reconciled is either in another branch of government. It's either in the courts or it's in Congress. And that disconnect becomes very challenging for individuals when decisions are made. Because if an individual employee is not focused on the text of the statute and makes a decision, the consequences to the individual are the same as if they were,
right,
in terms of their avenue to opportunity. And I'll give you one example. I was in Florida, and people had a challenge with a particular issue. When I went back and looked at the issue, the Department of the Interior had interpreted a statute erroneously. I mean, beyond erroneously, about 30 years ago. And that interpretation was written by a lawyer in the last day of administration virtually. And that interpretation had stood for nearly 30 years. And it's related to the Coastal Barrier Management Act. And basically the decision had a big consequence to communities that needed to seek replenishment for beaches and other things. It had a big effect. It was wrong. But it had stood for a very long time because the cost of challenging it and being successful, there's maybe a degree of ambiguity there, were very, very high. And ultimately, somebody came in, basically, I understood this. I sat down with people, and it just happened that there was a weekend where I read the opinions. The weather was bad. I had some extra time. I read the opinions. I said, no, we're going to change that opinion. But it stood for 30 years. And the agency hated the new interpretation, let me tell you. And then when I left, they worked to come up with a way to say, well, this is ambiguous and we'll go back to the old way, which is just an example of where they wanted to be. They liked that regulatory power. And rather than asking Congress for it specifically, they preferred to live in that ambiguity, hoping that no one else will take a shot at it over the next 30 years.
So it's almost a form of administrative inertia.
Yeah.
Once they get a decision or a position in place, a policy position in place, it's going to be very difficult to move that regardless of the policy of a new administration, or even in your example, what the statute actually says.
That's right.
So is that one of the challenges also with being in the political leadership, where you come into an agency? You had experience in the Department of Interior through the Bush administration and with the work you've done. But I would assume some of our political appointments don't necessarily have the same level of expertise with their agencies as you had. And does that create another level of challenges with the career employees?
So I think one thing you see in 8 years in the Bush administration, I think about 300 employees, 300 political appointees went through the Department of the Interior. So on average, a political appointee works about 18 to 24 months for a Senate confirmed employee. And that's a short amount of time relatively. Many of them have little experience with the underlying laws of the agency. Many of them have little experience with the processes that the agency uses to make decisions, let alone the things like where's the cafeteria. And so it is a uphill, it's an education just to figure out how the system works on one hand. And it's even a more challenging dynamic if you're trying to lead change in a direction that maybe the agency hasn't historically gone. I can remember working for Secretary Norton. One of my first issues I worked on in the first couple of days in my new job as a low-level staffer. I had a problem with the Park Service. I had an issue related to the Park Service. So I went down to the Park Service's office and sat down with them and told them, hey, I think, this is not consistent with where the secretary would like to be. And we need to think maybe through a different policy. And I'll never forget, they looked at me and said, well, we probably won't help you with that. And I went back to my office on the 6th floor of the Department of the Interior, and I shut my door and I was like, oh my goodness, I have no idea, as a young attorney, what I do now. Like, there was no manual. There's no manual on how to be an effective political appointee. And what you ultimately learn is that you have to go look at the text of the statute yourself. You have to read the regulation, and you have to then look at the details and the facts, and ultimately come to your independent analysis, informed by all of the information employees want to provide you. But that involves a lot of work. And it's often easier as a political appointee to just take the file that you're given, check the box and hand it to the next guy, right? And so that is what happens a lot. Now, when I worked for President Trump, the Trump administration, the president wanted results and outcomes, okay? And that was fantastic because a result or an outcome requires you to do more than think about checking the box. And it allowed competent administrators to drive change at a rate that was much different than my experience in the Bush administration.
Well, and I think that that's all very interesting because what you're essentially saying is that there has become in some of these agencies, at least with your personal experience, and I think the research that you have done since you left the administration in terms of this issue is that there's a variety of ways in which the career employees, and again, there are a lot of career employees that do exactly what they're told and they carry out the mission of the new administration. But you're seeing more and more where there is this kind of resistance and the different mechanisms in which this resistance will come to the forefront, including simply looking at a new political appointee and saying, we're not going to do that. We're just simply not going to carry out that policy. With that, it seems to me like there's really only one way to ratchet all of this, that the ratchet is always going in one direction, which is whatever the underlying policy might be of one administration, say the Obama administration, or even the Clinton administration, the roadless rule. I was just reading about an effort to try to make some changes to the roadless rule in Alaska during the last administration. And as you and I both know, the roadless rule was put into place in less than 12 months. But in an effort to change that rule or change the application of that rule in a small area in Alaska, it took over 2 years. And so that's the kind of inertia you get. It's a ratchet to increase regulation, increase oversight, increase government power, but we don't ever see a policy being implemented of decreasing it or ratcheting it the other way. Is that your experience as well?
I think history shows that to be the case. And I really think what you're pointing out is that agencies, if they want to, can move with great speed and with great energy. If they don't want to, it takes a lot of work to pull them in the right direction. And that ultimately comes down to, that's also my belief fundamentally, that all agencies will get to the point of accountability you establish. That if you're willing to establish a point of accountability and hold the line to it, they will move there. They will move there. But that requires a lot of effort and a lot of demands of the political appointee. The political appointee has to be willing to say, look, this is the way our government functions. I'm here to make these decisions and I'm happy to make them. Help me make them. But they may not move with the amount of dispatch that they would move for a different process. And if that's the case, in my view, the most easy, the most logical thing for the employee, the political appointee to do is just do it, drive forward. But that asks a lot of political appointees. And it also requires an executive and a president who wants to see change, because without that, there is, very little support for those types, the effort of, I will decide and I'll be responsible. And if you won't do it, I'll do it. There are also ways that you can deal with challenging employees, but those take time and diligence too. And at times, the political appointees don't want to do that, to be honest with you. And so, it's a mix. And our challenges today are a mix of the willingness of political leadership to drive forward and the ability of agencies to just do their own thing and march to their own agenda, irrespective of what the American people have identified as the agenda.
Well, with the NCLA, we often talk about agencies and we talk about, well, how can the SEC pursue a particular policy that we believe is absolutely contrary to the statute? How can the USDA get up one day and adopt a two-page fact sheet to require all livestock producers to use RFID ear tags at a cost of $2 billion without going through a rulemaking process? How do we, again, to use the word, continuously ratchet up where the government seems to be taking and subsuming much more power over the individuals in this country, even though you may have a policy from on high that says, no, we're going to try to deregulate, we're going to try to take power out of Washington, D.C., but it doesn't seem like we get there. And so in researching again for today, some of the things I read about were the ideas of slow walking and just refusing to do the work, and also providing memos or legal analysis that only provided one side of the story. And so as a political leader, how do you address those kinds of challenges within an agency that has the kind of impact that a Department of Interior does, especially in the Western states?
So those things happened in a variety of formats, and people can talk about those. And I think it comes down to this, honestly. Comes down to this. I'll give you an example. When I was first at the Department of the Interior in 2001, I watched a nominee go through a process and be confirmed to be the head of the Park Service. And the minute she arrived, the Park Service had planned her next couple of months as trips to various parks throughout the country, which would make complete sense in a way, right? But it's my opinion that they did that to show her all the issues that they had, so that when she came back, she was thinking primarily about the issues that they had shown her, which I thought was quite clever in a way. But what the political leadership has to do, in my opinion, is ultimately the president has to decide, do we want to do things or not? And your constant ratcheting down, I will tell you from my opinion, there's a long standing view of both parties that at times they really didn't want to do much, okay? And that has an effect, but we're in a place in our country where we need to change course. And then it comes down to, can you teach political appointees how to administer and lead their offices in ways that are ethically compliant, legally compliant, consistent with the protocols of the agency?
Can we?
And my view is that the best way for young politicals to learn is to work in a system and have that opportunity. I learned a great deal from both the successes and failures of each of the secretaries that I've worked with. And my Secretary Norton had a theory that as a young staffer, one of the benefits of that experience was learning from others. And I believe that's true. And I feel very good about the future of the next administration because I think that a number of folks will have good experience about how to get results in agencies. But it does take effort. And it's really just beginning to think we might be able to turn the coin. But at the end of the day, you can, if you have the willingness and the courage to do it, you have to have the comfort with the law and the willingness to deal with the facts.
So we need political leaders who are willing to
That's right.
study, and they've got to know as much as the
They have
people
to
in
do the
those
work.
agencies. They have to do the work.
The work matters. And a lot of these jobs, you go in, you think, well, I mean, not you, any of you personally, but a person thinks this is going to be a capstone to my career. No, it's public service. It's an opportunity to make a difference or not. And the president needs to put people in that will want to make a difference.
So I'd like to talk to you about some of the situations that you encountered, such as you previously told me about a mouse whisperer.
That's
that was in your agency, and the challenges that you had under those circumstances.
So some of you may have worked with the Endangered Species Act, and it's a very important statute. And I actually have spent a lot of time with that statute. And there's a lot of things that I really like about it. There's some things that I wish maybe were a little differently written and certainly differently administered. But I traveled again to Florida. I was at the Gulf Coast, and there was an issue with a particular species, and I heard from the community on one hand, and then I went and met with the folks at the Fish and Wildlife Service. And you begin meetings like, "Hi, I'm David. How are you? What do you do?" And I get to this one person, and she says, "I speak for the mice." And I said, "Excuse me?" And she said, "Well, I speak for the mice." And I said, "Oh, where's that come from?" And she says, "Well, it comes from the Endangered Species Act." And I'm like, "Well, that's the only act I know really, really well. So I'm pretty sure it's not in that act." But the point is that she believed, she's passionate about her job, and that's great. Okay. We want people to be in government service and have great passion. But she believed that she was an advocate for the mouse. And she is an advocate for serving the American people well by well and faithfully executing the law. That's the oath she took. And to do that, you need to understand the law itself. And the law itself doesn't say you are the spokesman for the mice. You play an important role in ensuring that agencies don't take actions that are likely to jeopardize the continued existence of the mouse. You play an important role in deciding whether a mouse should be listed. You don't speak for it. You serve the American people.
Right.
And so that just gives you a window into people's perspectives.
Well, did you encounter any circumstances within your agency where you were attempting to carry out a particular policy that had come from the administration, and you met with resistance from either sub-agencies or the attorneys in your office or career employees, whatever they might be?
So I had a unique experience my second time around because I had served so long in the Department of the Interior. I'd spent 8 years there. I was the solicitor. And many of the senior managers had experienced me as a younger attorney. And I think they did not, so as a consequence of that, 99.9% of my experiences with them were never difficult because they knew that when they walked in to meet with me, I'd probably read the file. They knew I knew the law. And so the vast majority of my experiences were positive. I had instances where, for example, the Fish and Wildlife Service had done a massive project and a document. I took it home and read it over the weekend. And I came back and I told them, "I just read your document. I don't believe for a minute any office of the solicitor attorney that knows anything would have ever signed off on this document. So you may have spent many years working on it, but why don't you take it down a couple quarters down the hall and you have an attorney come tell me that they agree with your legal, that their legal analysis is in concurrence with your views." And whenever they did that, they generally found out that the solicitor's view of the law was mine. And so I had some of those instances. And those are instances that if you're prepared you do deal with, right?
Mhm.
But I really didn't have any. A lot of younger employees and a lot of employees at other agencies, I'm aware of stories of resistance. But at Interior, we had a process where if something was difficult, generally you elevated it and somebody made a decision about it.
Some of the examples that I've heard of the resistance that you've talked about is a circumstance with some of the issues we've dealt with here, including Title IX and the new regulations to come out of the Department of Education. Some of the problems that they encountered were that the staff didn't agree with Secretary DeVos's changes to the regulations and actually either produced unusable drafts or made it impossible for them to move forward, to where the political appointees were the ones that eventually had to take control of that process and that situation and move forward, because the career employees wouldn't work on that particular regulation. Are you aware of circumstances like that, either with the Department of Education or other agencies?
Absolutely. And I'm aware of that story. I'm not, personally aware of the facts, but that, at the end of the day, it's pretty easy for an employee who doesn't like disagrees with something to not do a good job on its work if they're asked to work on it. So generally what you should do, just as a best practice, is you need to go through the material and ensure that you've done your diligence to support their analysis.
So tell us a little bit about the challenges with it being an agency head of dealing with the coronavirus, some of the personal challenges that you had.
Well, we were very, very lucky. The Department of the Interior, we have a lot of employees, and I was lucky in that we had a group of 98 public health officers that work in the National Park Service. And I thought I knew pretty much everything about the Department of the Interior. And when COVID occurred, I was not aware that we had these public health officers. And it turned out for me to be a really fortunate thing, because as we were reacting to COVID, we were able to bring a couple of those officers in to my office. And I basically said, look, I need you to teach me everything you understand about this. I want you to be here as we work through these issues. And I want your input on everything so that I can understand the facts here. And those were really, that experience was really helpful to me. Early on, when the COVID situation was occurring, a big question we had was, what were the effects outdoors? And obviously you can imagine why the Department of the Interior might care about that. What I found really interesting, they were able very early to be looking at studies in China and others. And I was interested to see, was there any indication of transmission outdoors? And they looked at a whole host of work related to construction crews. And they could not find a single instance of construction crews working together and there being transmission. What they always would find is like somebody got it at home and brought it to work, but there'd be no transmission between employees, which I found interesting, and that was helpful in informing not only what we would do with visitation, but what we would do with crews. So they were a wonderful asset to us. Now, they were also very clear when I first met with them that as public health officers, they have one mission, right?
Mm-hmm.
Public health. Just like if you ask a biologist, like the biologist, one mission, biology, right? And I sat down with them and had a discussion about, look, that's great. And that should inform my decision. But is that the only thing that informs my decision? And obviously the answer to that is no, right? There's more that informs an administrator's decision at the end of the day than merely, and not merely, but public health is an important component. But is it the absolute only component you think of? Well, the answer to that is obviously not. I mean, if you look, one of the other things they did is they brought me the list of everything we deal with on a daily basis at, say, a park, in terms of restrooms or whatever. And the list of things that are not good in these facilities is really actually quite long when you look at it. And we have a lot of things to deal with that. You know, we have particular clothing you wear, and that clothing is largely there because of the negative impact of cleaning agents, right? So there's a whole set of risks that we deal with every single day that we don't think about at all, okay? And that was a great understanding and discussion to have with them as I was able to make decisions going forward and think about this in its appropriate context, but also in a way that was commensurate with other risks that we deal with every day.
Well, was there a recommendation about keeping the parks closed from some of your employees?
So we had a lot of interesting ones. Actually, I got an initial idea from Yosemite, and it was this: that basically their plan for dealing with COVID. There's 900 employees at Yosemite, 900 Park Service employees, and their plan initially was to close the park, gate it closed, have the 900 employees live there, and do video programming of the park. And you know, my big question after listening to that was, why would we need employees if we close the park? I can understand why we needed law enforcement. I can understand why we needed facilities people, but I wasn't sure we needed employees. And they went back and thought about their plan, and you know, we ended up moving in a different direction on that one. There were also instances, and I was very cognizant of this. We had instances where, and if you remember, the initial stop the spread effort was really an issue about, could we manage the capacity of our medical services, hospitals? That was the key effort at the time, key issue at the time. So I had small communities like Estes Park, Colorado, but they were very fearful that they wouldn't have the ability to handle the medical situation. And we worked to accommodate their issues. But the vast majority of time, we kept the parks open. We developed a tool with the public health officials that allowed us to look at every function in a park or a BLM area and say, okay, we have a theater, we have a visitor center, we have a cafeteria or restrooms. How do we dial things down appropriately? And the reason I wanted a tool is I wanted to have something that you could also dial back up with the same standard if you had it. But that meant that ultimately we closed a lot of our facilities and left the areas open. And I think if you look at visitation in 2020, that was a very good decision because people needed the solace of the outdoors. They experienced the outdoors and they loved the outdoors. And I think we had a very positive impact. The other thing is I don't think it changed the experience of the visitor that much. And here's why. When we were doing it at first, I said to the Park Service, look, I don't know anyone that ever drove from Colorado, where I'm from, to the Grand Canyon and got to the Grand Canyon, got out in the parking lot of the Grand Canyon. And the first thing they said is, I can't wait to see the movie. I don't believe that ever happened, right? I don't think it ever happened. So we don't need to worry that much about the movie theater. Like, it's an important feature, but let's make sure there's access to that Grand Canyon. And if we know we can do that safely, we'd be crazy not to do it. Other things like the Washington Monument, we closed. But we really tried to maintain access, and I think that was good for the American people.
Mhm. In terms of some of your experience in dealing with judicial oversight of agency action and decision, what are some of your observations in that regard?
Well, I think, and I know this is something that you're personally so passionate about. I mean, I think here's the reality. If you believe that Congress passes statutes that are less than clear, occasionally, or maybe more often than not, and then if you have a judiciary that basically says, look, you know, we are here to give significant deference to an agency decision in the moment of ambiguity. Those two elements together, a real delegation, if you will, on one hand, and great deference on the other, puts a lot of eggs in the executive branch basket. And if you do that, and then have an overlay of that we have actors in the executive branch that may not feel accountable to any political party or any political leadership, not party, but any political leadership, then you have a situation where there really is no recourse in a meaningful way for the decisions that are made. So, you know, and we'll see over time as to whether there's a more robust view of judicial oversight or not. But I believe that those two things together are really a grave problem for representative government at the end of the day.
And that's really what NCLA has been challenging and working against. Deference is a big issue for us in looking at Chevron deference, and as well as the non-divestment or the non-delegation doctrine is something that really this firm was created for. And the way that Philip Hamburger, our founder, talks about it is that this firm was put together to try to break some of those toys. And some of those toys are the deference and the delegation of congressional or legislative power. I think we've really seen it during the course of this coronavirus. And there are a lot of, I think that when this firm was started, I'm not sure that the intent was that those would be the kinds of cases we would end up with, because I don't think any of us ever expected that we would have a situation where the CDC would issue a document of some sort prohibiting all evictions, you know, putting an eviction moratorium in place. I don't think any of us could have foreseen 2 to 3 years ago that we would have vaccine mandates, or that we would have a federal government that would say all federal employees must have a vaccine mandate, or universities doing the same thing. So fortunately, NCLA has been here, and we've been challenging and fighting a lot of those battles. But a lot of it really does come back to that deference issue. And I'm sure, as being an agency head, there were times that you appreciated the concept of deference. But I would also assume that as an insider and someone who cares about our republic and our constitutional framework, that you realize the damage that a Chevron deference has done to the separation of powers and really the balance of power in Washington, D.C., and even with the states. Do you see ways to challenge that, or additional ways to try to pull back or try to limit the deference that the courts have been willing to give to these agencies?
Well, I'm on this issue, I'm a big believer that the best thing that could happen is that the branch of government that is most accountable to the people, which is Congress, would be more rigorous in either clarifying laws or creating areas of sunset for laws, but creating a dynamic that allows the people to have legislation that maybe doesn't empower the executive in the ways that it will. Ultimately, the courts, you know, at the end of the day, my view of the deference issue is fundamentally, it's a question of the courts deciding, does a court in the first instance get to make that question of law or not, right?
Mhm.
And there are reasons to think maybe that's best vested in the executive branch. So I understand why they got there. But I would think of anybody that was ready to do it, it should be that district judge, right? But if they're going to take a while to figure it out, I believe the place that it has to be done is Congress has to say, agencies, your interpretations need to be reasonable. And if they're not, we're going to call you up here and talk to you about your budget. We're going to do oversight on how you're interpreting these things. And we're going to change them where there's degrees of ambiguity that have frustrated activities. A lot of the deference questions ultimately become, is the agency exerting authority that it wants, but it doesn't clearly have? And that seems to me to be the perfect place for Congress to say, you're not getting $1 for that, or we're not, we're going to solve that issue for you. I used to testify a lot in Congress and get a lot of questions about climate change. And I would say, look, one of the first things I did as secretary is I asked for a report when I was deputy. I said, look, go find out every obligation I have under the law for climate change. We sent our lawyers out, they did it, they came back. They had like 2 things. One was I had to provide some guy to do a report, and one related to water. And I'm like, well, if that's what Congress has said so far, like
That's it.
Congress could go, if Congress wants to do this. So then I'd have congressmen and women basically saying they'd like me to do something, to which I'd say, great, like pass the law and I'll do it. That's how I do everything else. It's not Dave Bernhardt's personal playground.
Well, and what was the response? Did they take you up on that?
They didn't appreciate that.
They are in some ways, perhaps they have become, they being our congressional representatives, have become comfortable in allowing agencies to make some really broad-based and extremely important and potentially financially crushing decisions without any kind of legislative oversight, which again goes back to the basis of our republic, or
right.
the lack of the basis in our republic. The SEC just this past week issued a new docket, or there at least a notice of proposed rulemaking that they're going to go forward with a regulation requiring everybody to disclose upstream and downstream impacts, their carbon footprints. And I look at the banking industry, for example, that funds everything from maybe a small oil and gas company to ranchers and farmers and implement dealers and a local car dealer and a used car dealership and a grocery store. And I think about the magnitude of attempting to do that and realizing that Congress, number one, has absolutely no role in this whatsoever, thinking about the reporting requirements and things. And I cannot get my arms around the idea that anybody would think that an agency could unilaterally issue a rule or a declaration of that under any circumstance whatsoever under our form of government. And I'm sure that someone will challenge it in that way. But I would assume you feel the same way, that you just can't make those kinds of momentous decisions through an SEC rulemaking or guidance document.
Well, the whole theory, right, is that Congress does pass the law. And so, that is the place to start. And at times they simply don't want the accountability, but that is where it needs to start.
That's where it needs to start. So what are some of the solutions that you think to address and to provide more congressional oversight, as well as to limit the power of what might be a rogue employee or employees who do not want to carry out the policies of an administration? What do you think some of the solutions are?
So I think first off, our political appointees need to be well-trained in personnel, just like they're trained in other things before they serve. On one hand, I think the Congress is the place for oversight. They need to do that. And ultimately, it's my belief that the only way these issues are ultimately dealt with is the American people say, hey, our government is not functioning optimally. and we need to demand a change. And until that happens, there may not be the political will to really make change. But you can, if you're a manager of an organization, you can deal with troubled employees completely appropriately. It takes effort. If you want more policy done in a particular way, you can drive that. It just takes will, it takes support, and it takes ultimately leaders that are willing to make change and hold people accountable for results.
Some of the things that I've picked up in talking to you about these issues are things such as doing Congress to provide more oversight of agencies. I think that it's absolutely imperative that Congress reclaim their rightful place at the table and provide more oversight of these agencies. And you've alluded to it a couple times, and that is the power of the purse. And I do not believe with these omnibus spending bills, we have nearly the control that Congress should have in light of the fact that they're the ones that appropriate the money. Congress has to draft legislation that isn't deliberately ambiguous. That's where the Chevron types of deference and that whole line of cases have been able to slip in the door and allow these agencies to fill in all the blanks. I think Congress needs to have the courage to make some tough decisions. And with being able to deficit spend a $30 trillion deficit debt, I think that they have not been willing to make the tough decisions that are eventually going to come down the road, probably sooner rather than later. We need to put better people in places to make better decisions. I think you've said that just a moment ago, making sure that our political leaders in these agencies have the capacity and the experience and background to do this, arm our political appointees so that they can make good decisions and implement them. And then again, getting rid of the agency's toys, the Chevron deference, that sort of thing. So I think we've got some good, very general ways to fix things, but we need to talk more in terms of specifics. But at the same time, I know that we've got some questions. There are some folks who have questions, and I want to make sure that we get to that at this time. So do we have some questions, Craig, or some? Myron, I know that you have a question over here.
Oh, I have several. Thank you. That was very useful discussion. Congress makes the laws, but with the federal lands are 27% of the country in terms of acreage. And as you said at the beginning, David, they control the economies of the rural West, and they've been increasingly putting those economies out of business. Okay, Congress actually can't do oversight of the federal lands, it's not a management agency. The hearings that they hold are mostly about creating new units of the National Park Service or wild and scenic rivers or wilderness areas. They don't do any oversight of the actual management of those lands, and I don't think they're actually capable of it. And so that seems to me to be a much bigger problem than with other federal agencies, where you can actually go in and do oversight and investigations and see why this law isn't being followed or isn't being implemented or it isn't working. But I just don't get that. I spent hundreds of hours at hearings in the Interior Committee and the Natural Resources Committee. I can't ever remember them going into mismanagement or and what we need to do to make them better. It's all, let's get a new something that named after me.
Well, so Myron has a long history of asking me harder questions. So here's what I'll say about this. First off, let's just take process, okay? When I came into the Department of the Interior, it took, on average, 90 days for a document that BLM sent, a 2-page notice that says basically, we'd like to do something in the Federal Register, just a simple notice. It took over 90 days for that notice to move from the one floor of Interior to the Federal Register, okay? And that was after somebody had spent months working on it out in the field. When I looked at that, 30 or 40 people were touching that individual document, okay? And I asked why that was. And nobody could provide me a history of exactly what happened. So here's what they ended up telling me. They said that Federal Register notices used to go out from state directors at BLM. And then one day, sometime in the 90s, a chief of staff came to his nice office. Chief of staff is a very nice office of Interior. He went into his office and there were one of three papers. I don't know which one he looked at particularly, but I know it was only one of three because I've tried to order papers and I can only ever get three at the Department of the Interior. And so whichever one of those three he picked up and read, it had an article about the Department of the Interior. And he said, how did this happen? Something that surprised him. So he was told that the article had come from the Federal Register. So he decided that he would start reviewing the Federal Register. So he does. Now, I'm going to make this up, but I believe this happened because otherwise the facts don't, the outcome doesn't make any sense. I believe a few days later, the deputy secretary walked into his office and said, what are you doing? And the chief of staff said, well, I'm reading the Federal Register notice. And the deputy secretary probably said, well, you're a staffer for the secretary. That's an operational issue. I need to read the Federal Register. So the minute that happened, then the solicitor finds out the deputy's reading it and decides that the solicitor has to read everything before it goes to the deputy. So the solicitor's reading it. The minute that happens, the assistant secretaries are all like, oh my gosh, the chief of staff, the deputy secretary, solicitor are reading something. So suddenly they're all reading it. If the assistant secretaries are reading it, the bureau directors are reading it. If a bureau director is reading it, 5 other people are reading it because otherwise they're not important enough to have dealt with the bureau. And suddenly you have 60 people reading this, 30, 40, whatever, a lot. So I said, what was interesting about it is if you ask them a question about the document, whoever brought it to you, they would come back 6 weeks later with an answer. Now the answer was never what you asked about. To that question is an answer to some other question because they would send the question all the way out to Rollins for a field office for an answer. And then they come back and by that time, who knows what the question actually was. So we did something really radical. I met with the BLM state directors and they said, we need to change our environmental review process. It's taken too long to get these notices out. I said, I got an idea. You read them, you have a lawyer read them, and you send them to me. And I'll read them. And the minute I'm done reading them, we'll do a call and I'll ask you questions about it. And if you can defend it, off to the Federal Register it goes. And we'll do one call and we'll ask everybody in DC, if you want to be on this call, you can. Well, I did one, and it was pretty clear the BLM state director had not read the document. The reason is these documents were god awful. They were like 1,500 pages. They're a gobbledygook of stuff. And I'd gone through it with the red line and they hadn't. And they found out that that's an awkward place to be. And so we then had a process going forward that moved those things very, very quickly. And the documents got better because the senior management had to read them. They got a little more concise because they realized how long it took to read. And my view, Myron, is there's a million things if people would just ask questions. And here's the thing. There's been no debate about public land management, really, since FLTMA.
That's right, since 1976.
Go back and look at that. And maybe, I'm not saying the debate, like I'm not a politician. I don't know if the debate should or should not happen, but I know it hasn't. So that'd be my answer. There's a lot for them to look at.
Yes, John.
I think at the at your time in Interior, they made a decision to send some of the people making the decisions out west. Can you tell us how that came about and what the result of it was?
Yeah, so Ryan Zinke, really the minute he was nominated, maybe even before he was nominated, felt very strongly that the Department of the Interior should be reorganized. And one of the things he wanted to do was move some agencies west, which makes their headquarters move west, which makes a lot of sense given where the lands are located. And to be fair, most of the employees in the Bureau of Land Management are already west. The truth is, we had a lot of challenges recruiting our best managers from BLM to work in Washington, D.C. Now, why do you think that would be? So the cost of living's higher, even with the locality pay. Your commute is longer. I mean, there's a lot of reasons. And if you worked at BLM, there might be a reason that you were, it appealed to you at the beginning, right? So we had a process. Ryan Zinke and Susan Combs went through this process for about 2 years of reorganization, and it was a real effort. I came in as secretary in 2019, and when I first sat down with BLM, it was pretty clear to me that they had not thought that they would, they'd gone to probably 1,000 meetings with Ryan and Susan Combs, who was the assistant secretary and had led this effort. And it was clear to me that they had not really thought that they'd actually have to move, despite the fact that they had a lease that was expiring. It was a great lease by the baseball park. And that was expiring. So they were moving no matter what. And I sat down with them and basically said, look, we're actually going to do this. And my notion was this, that it would really make sense to look at the people in the headquarters and try and place them in areas that they would do the most benefit. And here's why. We had a regulation effort on grazing at Interior. It never went anywhere. And here's part of the reason why. Our reg team in DC wrote a regulation. And then we took that regulation and we sent it to some field managers and range officials in some Western states. And they read the regulation and they told us it was completely incomprehensible, that they could not implement it. And I thought that was stunning, that the disconnect between our reg team and the people that actually have to enforce the reg was that different, number one. Number two, and this, I double checked this the other day because I thought maybe my memory was wrong. We had a very senior BLMer who came to one of my deputies' office and said he was really excited to be going west. I said, that's great. What are you going out there? He was going out for a trip. And he said he couldn't wait to see sagebrush. Now, if you know anything about the West and you know anything about BLM, you would think this person who worked at BLM many years would have seen sagebrush once. He hadn't. This was going to be a new experience for him. The sagebrush ecosystem makes up about, I think, 11 states and several provinces of Canada. So it's not as, it's a wonderful thing. But it was amazing to me that there was that type of disconnect. So our theory was take the mining folks, and let's locate them in an area where there's a lot of mining activity, where most of our field work is done on mining. So we went through a process of doing that. Now, here's what I really did. I told BLM they had a choice. They could figure out where to put these people based on these criteria, or I would. And they decided that they would do that. And so we ended up with a small headquarters office in Grand Junction, and most of the people moved. Now, to the extent that if they didn't want to move, what we did is we worked very hard to find them other opportunities in the DC area. So for example, some of the folks that were support staff, they actually came to work at the department's office of the secretary. We recruited them in. But by opening these jobs up and putting them where they needed to be for the best, to basically create little centers of excellence, I thought that'd be a very good thing. So we went through a process of I think about 500 positions. This new administration has decided the headquarters should be back here for BLM, and they made that decision, and they're trying to bring people back. Now, I'm really interested to see the following. We went through this process and we didn't have a single personnel action, which is really pretty amazing. So I'm looking forward to seeing and tracking if they have any personal actions in people maybe not wanting to come back. Because my own view is that if you give an employee an opportunity to be out there, they would find out that Grand Junction was a really great place to be, or Boise or whatever. The other thing was, I thought our state directors would be better supported by these people with expertise being out there. So that was our theory.
Well, I think that we're just about out of time. And so we're going to wrap it up. And I want to thank everyone for being here. I want to thank you for coming and having this discussion with us today. It was very interesting to hear an insider's view, especially from the standpoint on the personnel side of some of the challenges that you face and how that manifests itself in some of the issues that we deal with. So I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank the folks who joined us online. And I know that we will be having another luncheon law in the next couple of months. I don't know the exact date, but we will have that available on our website. And I appreciate everyone's attention. And we'll have a few minutes after this to chat as well. So thank you.